Welcome, everyone. My name is Michaela Klauser. I'm the Associate Director for Producer Education here at NCBA. Glad to have everyone join us this evening. We have some great content for you, sponsored by Central Life Sciences. As a participant, your line will be muted, but feel free to type in questions in the question box on your screen during the webinar. And at the end of the presentation, we will get to as many as time will allow. If you are having trouble with your technology or if you're joining just for the audio, the webinar will be recorded and will be available for viewing in a few days at ncba.org. Just look for the producer tab on the website. Tonight's webinar is titled How to Protect Your Cattle and Bottom Line. Will feature Mark Upton and Casey White with Central Life Sciences. Mark was born and raised in eastern Oklahoma and spent most of his childhood on a large commercial cow-calf operation. After receiving a bachelor's degree in business management from Oklahoma State University, he moved to South Carolina and began his career in animal nutrition, working with beef, dairy, and swine operations. He and his wife, Connie, returned to Oklahoma in 1994 and have resided in Pauls Valley for 27 years. They have two daughters. One is working on her master's at Oklahoma State, and the other is working on her doctorate in physical therapy at Baylor. For the past 19 years, Mark has been employed with Central Life Sciences and currently serves as the Director of Sales, Feed Additives. In this role, he manages a team of sales representatives who call on feed companies in the US and Canada to help bring pest management solutions to livestock producers. In his spare time, he enjoys his commercial cow-calf operation and raising and training rope horses. Also with us tonight is Casey. Casey was born and raised on a commercial cow-calf operation south of Marfa, Texas. After receiving his bachelor's degree in animal science from Angelo State University, he attended Texas A&M University, where he was awarded his master's degree in entomology with a focus in medical and veterinarian entomology. Upon graduation, Casey managed the veterinary entomology research laboratory at New Mexico State University for 2 years. His work was focused around conducting industry-sponsored efficacy evolutions of various insecticidal formulations against pest species of livestock. For the past 18 years, Casey has been employed with Central Life Sciences and currently serves as the Senior Director of Technical Services and Innovation. In his role, he manages a group of entomologists responsible for supporting their customers, end users, and sales and marketing groups, as well as conducting field trials, product evolution demonstrations, and education for existing products in their portfolio. Mark, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to the group tonight. Casey will pull up the presentation.
You see it there, Mark?
I do. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Perfect.
So we really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you tonight about fly control and why is it important. I think so many producers across the country just don't realize the damage that these flies are doing and how they're costing you every day in terms of economic losses. And so some of the things that we know we need to be concerned about is obviously we're trying to utilize our available forages as best as possible. We want to use those forages to convert into meat and milk. That's what that cow's for, is to convert those forages into meat or milk. We know that these flies create a tremendous amount of stress and discomfort. The cows actually are spending energy twitching their tail, shaking their heads. They can be bunched up together. Not to mention the fact that when they lose blood to these flies, they're having to replenish that blood supply, and that costs energy. They're using feedstuffs or these forages to replenish their blood supply. We know that in order to maximize our herd efficiency and comfort, that's key to revenue potential. If those cows are comfortable, they're not fighting these flies and other issues, then they're going to be the most profitable for us. So it's very important that we try to implement some strategies to keep these flies to a minimum.
So most of the rest of the presentation tonight will be focused on these 4 types of flies, and these are the 4 main fly species that we're going to find in any livestock production facility. And we try and categorize these or subcategorize these into two different groups. And they're kind of break down based on some of the biology and the behavior of these flies. And they break down pretty easily into the two on the left being more premise type flies or flies that you're going to find in confinement animal operations, and then the two on the right there being more pastured cattle flies. And so we'll start with the housefly. The housefly on the left there, very opportunistic fly. They're going to breed in all kinds of material, including manure mixtures, garbage. They're going to feed on all kinds of different things with their sponging, sucking type mouth parts, and lay eggs in any of these decaying organic matter or manure mixtures, and be able to develop into the next generation of flies. The next fly is one of our blood feeding flies. This is a stable fly, and you do get some stable flies in pasture cattle situations, but oftentimes you're going to find them in confinement, dairies, feedlots, around horse facilities, or even, if you've got just a handful of animals in the backyard, whether that be show animals or just one or two horses standing around, you can find stable flies present. They're going to feed on the legs of the animals typically, and they're the ones that are usually responsible for that kicking and stomping response that you see as a fly fighting or fly avoidance behavior. And then we're going to spend the majority of the time over on these other two flies, the face fly and the horn fly in particular. But just to touch on the face fly and some of the face fly behaviors, these are the flies they're very closely related taxonomically to the housefly. In fact, most entomologists will even tell you that you've got to get these flies under a watch glass or a microscope to be able to distinguish the two species from one another. But they're going to feed on the face of the animals, primarily on facial secretions and such, and are very typically geographically, located within the U.S. If you draw a line across I-40, north of I-40, you're going to have face flies. South of I-40, it's going to be somewhat limited based on the heat that you usually get in the summer months. So, and then finally the horn fly, which is the one, the small little fly that you find on the backs of animals. They're both males and females are going to be blood feeding flies, and they're going to take 35 to 40 blood meals a day. And both of these flies lay eggs in intact manure pats, and so that's why they are focused primarily and found primarily in pasture cattle situations. You get in confinement and just the animals that are moving around, pens being scraped, that sort of thing. It's not going to support face fly and horn fly larval development. So these guys are primarily in the pasture because of those larval development sites. And so which flies are causing you problems? Remember, just as a summary, the house and the face flies are going to be your confinement fly species and found in dairy, equine, swine, and beef confinement facilities or operations. And the horn fly and the face fly are going to be your species most commonly found in pastured cattle situations.
So what you've got here is two different pictures, and we've got on the left was labeled good control and on the right poor control. And quite frankly, oftentimes these may be two herds of cows just across the county road from each other. We want to see those cows spread out across the pasture and grazing. We don't want to see them bunched up in a corner like this because flies are what has put them there. Occasionally we'll get a call from a producer saying, man, I think my cows have too many flies on them. Drive out there, look at his cows. And while there may be more flies than he wants to see, they're spread out across the pasture versus we'll literally see the neighbor's cows that are bunched up in a corner. And big reason for that is because especially the horn fly is not a very good traveler. It likes to stay on the animal that it landed on right after it flew out of that manure pat after it matured to an adult. So obviously These cows, like on the right, they're making a mud hole. They're hot. They're trying to get to the center of that group of animals to try to get away from these flies as best they can. And that's just not ideal. Sometimes you even see them standing off in a pond. We want those cows spread out, grazing and utilizing that forage.
So this next picture is just kind of a cool picture. It may be only cool to those of us that are that have entomology backgrounds or interests, but this is an engorged stable fly. So you can see that abdomen's completely full of blood and this really distinctive bayonet type mouth part sticking out in front of the head of this fly. This is very indicative of a stable fly. And once you kind of start looking at flies and trying to identify flies out in the field to try and provide solutions or determine where to target some of your IPM control tactics and strategies, it's important to be able to recognize that this is a stable fly. So just a close-up picture of a stable fly that I wanted to show here. In this slide, we're talking about some of the economic impacts of stable flies, and these are two feedlot type trials, but it's very important for us to just show that in confinement type situations, these stable flies can really impact weight gain. And so the top little paragraph there or sentence kind of summarizes a study that was done on cattle being fed a growing ration, and only 50 flies per animal reduced weight gains by 0.2 of a pound per day, and feed efficiency by almost 13%. And then the next study, there was twice as many stable flies on the animals. 100 stable flies per animal reduced weight gains by 0.5 pound per day, and feed efficiency by almost 11%. And these were animals being fed a finishing ration. The face fly, as I mentioned earlier, these are the guys that feed primarily on facial secretions of cattle and other animals. The big thing here is this is the fly that gets implicated and is cause for spreading pink eye. Moraxella bovis is the causative agent, and they, because of their feeding behavior, if they're feeding on an animal that has pink eye, and there's a lot of facial secretion, lots of tear and fluid being produced by that eye, and then they move to a non-infected animal, it's spreading that pathogen between animals. And just to summarize again, this species is going to be geographically limited based on the amount of heat that is experienced in the southern half of the U.S. So again, I-40 across the country, anything north of that, you're likely to see face fly populations typically peaking late spring, early summer. They'll drop off usually in the heat of the summer, even in those northern states where you do have face fly populations, and then they'll peak again in late summer, early fall. And this is all dependent on temperature, humidity, and other weather conditions. This is an electron microscopy photo of the mouth part of a hornfly. So you can see that this is a mouth part that lends itself to being very efficient at slicing through the skin, the hide of those animals, and enabling this hornfly to take many blood meals throughout the day. And as I mentioned, it's 35 to 40, both males and female hornflies feed on blood, and they're going to stay on that animal day and night. The females are going to lay eggs. They'll leave the animal to lay eggs in freshly deposited cattle manure pats, and then they'll go right back to that animal where they're protected and they have that food source readily available to them. So when you get several hundred or thousands of flies on an animal taking 30 to 40 blood meals a day, it's causing serious irritation and aggravation to that animal as it's trying to provide, find some relief by fighting those flies, swishing tails, slinging heads, all that sort of thing. And of the 4 fly species that we're discussing tonight, this is the smallest, but it is the most economically damaging. It's the most pervasive and costly external parasite of cattle, pastured cattle in the U.S. or North America, I should say, costing the industry over $1 billion a year. So what do? They're feeding on that, and the main loss is related to weaning weight gain. So there's studies that have been conducted all the way back into the mid 70s and earlier than that show that controlling horn flies can help increase weaning weights by over 20 pounds per head. So when you multiply that across your herd size, you're talking about real dollars that can be saved or realized if a good horn fly control program is implemented and those weight gains are realized. One of the things or the contacts that we made over the years is with a researcher that started his career out at Louisiana State University, and he was a man by the name of Steve Nickerson. And Dr. Nickerson started, he really did a lot of work in mammary development, mostly in dairy cattle, but early on he started looking at some of the beef cattle herds at LSU, and was noticing that even in heifers that were put out on pasture just to grow out before they were bred for the first time were coming in with teat damage. And so he started looking into what is causing this damage. Why are these animals coming in with scabs formed on their teat ends? And so in his research and throughout his discovery process, he found that this was damage caused by hornflies, and hornflies were feeding on these teat ends because it was something where it was easily accessible to the surface of the skin of those teats, and as they fed, they would cause significant irritation, and then these scabs would develop, and these scabs would begin to be colonized by all kinds of bacteria, namely some of these mastitis causing bacteria such as Staph aureus and some of the others. And so this is just one summary slide. He did a study where he was evaluating the percentage of heifers that were coming in testing positive for some of these mastitis causing organisms, and the total percentage of the heifers that were coming in that were being clinically diagnosed with mastitis even prior to first parturition. So as you can see in the far left column there, he had 100% of the heifers coming in that were in the group without any fly control being offered were coming in and testing positive here. And so, what we've wondered and what we continue to look at is what amount of damage is being caused even before these heifers are being bred and calving for the first time. What kind of damage is being caused to that udder? And even though it may not be resulting in a true blind quarter, it may certainly reduce the milk producing tissue or limit the full potential of that heifer before she's ever even calved or raised her first calf. And so, if you can start out even when these young female animals controlling fly populations, it's going to make that heifer and eventually that cow perform better and milk better later on in life by reducing the amount of potential damage that she could be exhibiting later on because of these infections. So one of the things that you'll often hear about when you talk about any kind of external parasite control, whether that's in livestock or companion animal around homes or in row crops, is IPM gets thrown out a lot. And what IPM stands for is integrated pest management. And it's simply just really an effective environmental approach to managing pest species. And it's taking a bunch of different tools that may be available to you and using those in a way that all of those tools work together and none of them contradict or interfere with the effectiveness of any of the other ones that are being used in a program or an approach. And and really just kind of works to preserve chemistry and promote the presence and the usefulness of beneficial insects in the environment and limit the overall impact on the environment itself. So we at Central Life Sciences, we we take this to heart, and we really like to promote a good, solid, sound, integrated pest management approach to controlling whatever pest species are being targeted. And this really, it consists of 3 phases: planning, implementation, and evaluation. And planning obviously helps operators understand their problem and charts out a path or a course to address that issue as you move into fly season. And then the implementation phase would just be, uh, having a program in place to use those insect control tactics to reduce the pest populations on the property, and have a method approach, a multifaceted approach to controlling these pests. So it's not relying solely on chemistry or adulticides that are not that are not really selective to any certain pest species and more broad spectrum. And then finally, evaluation. And the evaluation phase is very important because it allows us to measure the success of things and follow up on the effectiveness. And without checking and monitoring on a regular basis, there's no way to gauge how well a program's working and evaluate what adaptations are needed within a year or moving into the following year. So focusing on the planning phase in particular, you have to start out with an inspection around a facility, so or your pasture situation. So figuring out where the what fly species are present. If you're in a pasture such situation and you've just got horn flies, the plan that is put in place is going to be different than if you've got some stable flies that are developing in certain areas. If you're feeding round bales, that's an area that stable flies could be problematic. So the next point there is learn the most economical means for minimizing or reducing those insect infestations. So it may look different if you've got a friend or someone that that is in South Georgia and you're up in the Dakotas or something. Your approach may be very different, and a lot of it depends on pasture size, your ability to get in to that pasture situation and disturb manure paths or get cattle into a set of pens where you can spray or pour or something like that regularly. Set thresholds where insect populations result or dictate an action must be taken, and then just train your employees on the plan and how to use the different tactics that are involved or outlined into the plan most effectively to get maximum control of that target pest species. The implementation phase is really just using the true integrated pest management approach, the whole idea around the IPM program. So cultural, physical, biological, and chemical control efforts should be used in a manner that all of them work together, and you start with a cultural control type phase that involves cleanup or minimizing the number of areas where flies can develop. One of the things in trying to develop an IPM program in pasture cattle situations is that it gets somewhat limited in certain areas. You know, it's not practical to go harrow pastures in certain areas of the country. Um, if you've got small pastures or pastures that don't have a lot of, you know, creeks or trees and rocks and things like that, you might be able to get into some fields like that and harrow pastures, break up manure paths that limit the availability for those horn flies to lay eggs and develop in. Um, and then really a big one is maintaining good beneficial insect populations if it's possible. And dung beetles are one of the main species that can be used in a biological control program, whether you're releasing them yourself or you're just trying to promote the population that you've got, the natural population that you've got in an area. There's all kinds of dung beetles that, you know, all kinds of species that get thrown into the quote unquote dung beetle group. But, you know, there's some dung beetles that are predaceous in nature and they're going to feed on the fly larvae developing in those manure paths. There's some dung beetles that are that are just using that resource. So they're going to compete for that resource to lay eggs in. So they'll move that manure underground or ball it up, roll it off, and bury it where they can lay eggs and it themselves and have their immatures develop in that manure. So just promoting good beneficial insect populations is something that we like to promote, and both of our products, Alticid and Clarifly, we've got studies that show that they do not harm beneficial insect populations. An integrated pest management approach can be looked at in this pyramid type of an illustration, where you start with the bottom part of this pyramid, and then that's the foundation of your IPM program. And this foundation starts with a cultural control practice, like we said, limiting the larval development sites. You can use physical, mechanical approaches in certain situations. The pasture cattle situation doesn't lend itself to a lot of these type of things, but it certainly does lend itself to the next tier of the pyramid in the biological, you know, dung beetle, promoting those beneficial insects, the dung beetles. There's some parasitic wasps that some of you may be familiar with. They're oftentimes released in confinement type situations, and they go out and seek fly pupae and lay eggs in those pupal cases and feed on the developing pupae or the next generation of flies. So they can be very, very useful in certain situations. And then when you get to the top tier of this pyramid, this is your chemical approach, where you start using some chemistry to help you out. And we feel like that these biorational feed-through type products like Alticid or Clarifly can be used here. Alticid certainly is the product of choice in pasture cattle situations, and can be used as the foundation of any type of chemical control program. And then as you go on through the season, and if fly populations are exceeding expectations, there's several different adulticide type products that can be used. Everybody will be familiar with insecticidal ear tags that are one approach and can be very useful in situations where the application and the length of time that those ear tags are left in the animals are closely monitored, and tags are pulled out when the usefulness of the product has been met, and reduces any type of resistance build up to those chemicals. There's spray applications and pour-ons and type of applications that are very useful, and we'll discuss some of those a little bit later in the presentation as well. When you get into the cultural control practices in pasture situations, I mentioned earlier round bale feeding sites, and this is a very good example of a picture here that this round bale has been fed here for for quite some time. You can see the amount of wasted hay that is scattered out there and has been mixed with manure and urine, and when it rains, there's moisture that's retained here in all of this area, and this is the area that that really um, is prime habitat for stable flies to develop in. So stable flies will come in even if you've got just a few somewhere around, in the area, they'll come in and start laying eggs here, and before long, you've got a true stable fly population being raised out in a pasture situation. And so, what we recommend here it would be uh, either one, the producer can move his round bale feeding sites, even in the winter months when hay is being fed, limit the accumulation of this hay and it being scattered out, and the potential for it to be used as breeding sites later on when it warms up and begins raining. And then once you get to in a situation like this needs to be scraped up, piled up. If weather conditions allow, you can either burn it or it needs to be uh, hauled off and scattered on fields or something like that, where we really get this to dry out and it's not being a problem for us anymore. As I mentioned before, biological approaches is just the promotion of all these different types of beneficial insects. So they all play a role in helping us naturally manage these pest fly problems. And then you get into the biorational control using insect growth regulators as the foundation of any type of control program. And many IGRs, mimic naturally occurring biochemicals, which tell the insect to either stay in its immature stage or go ahead and molt or develop into the next life stage of that insect. And so exposing them to some of the active ingredients that you have in a feed-through type product, it'll either trick the insect, the developing larvae, into staying in its immature stage indefinitely, and it will never transition or go through metamorphosis and transform into the next generation of adult, um, as is the case for the product Alticid IGR. And Clarifly larvicide is a product that is typically used in confinement cattle situations, and it has a little bit different mode of action. It keeps the immature larvae, the fly larvae, from developing into the next instar. So it's gonna affect the deposition of chitin, which is a component of the exoskeleton of the insect, and the immature larvae just ends up dying as it's developing. So oftentimes we get asked, which feed-through product should I choose? You've got two of them, and you're telling me that they're very efficacious. Both of them are very efficacious, and a lot of times we we start off by in answering that question, we ask questions, and the first one is what fly species are you having a problem with, and what is your operation look like? What are the stocking rates? What are your pasture sizes? All of those things play into us helping to recommend the product, and the majority of the time, that product's going to be the Alticid IGR product. It's labeled for horn fly control, and it is it's been on the market since the late 70s and has never demonstrated any type of resistance in field horn fly populations. It's I guess the idea or the reason behind that is that it just so closely mimics the naturally occurring biochemicals in that developing insect that they're not able to differentiate between the two and develop resistance to it. And then another thing that comes into play when trying to recommend or put together a program is do you have neighbors, and what do those neighbors look like? If you've got all pastured cattle around you, you're probably just going to have horn flies and maybe some face flies. If you've got a pasture that neighbors a dairy or a feedlot or some of the swine facilities or something like that, you may have some of these other fly pests that are present, and it's a case by case basis on trying to determine what's the best solution in those type of situations. How Alticid works: Alticid IGR is formulated into your feed supplements, and we've got products that go into all of the major feed company supplement products. So regardless of formulation type, whether that be a block or a tub, a loose or granulated mineral, or a liquid feed type supplement, Alticid IGR can be formulated into that. It's consumed by the animal. The hornfly, like the female hornfly, leaves that animal, lays eggs in manure that contains the active ingredient of Alticid IGR in the manure, and as those larvae develop, they'll go ahead and pupate. They'll develop all the way through the larval stage. They'll pupate and never be able to transition from that pupal stage into the next generation of adults. So all of that takes place in about 6 to 8 days, all depending on temperature and humidity and environmental factors. But that usually is a good general rule to follow: 6 to 8 days for that development cycle to take place, and for us to break the life cycle of the next generation of hornfly. A lot of the times we get asked, when should I start feeding Alticid IGR? And what we recommend is that you start feeding Alticid IGR incorporated into your choice of supplement 30 days before your last average frost date in the spring or summer, depending on where you are in the country. So if you start feeding 30 days prior to that average last frost date, you're going to catch any early warm spells or anything like that. You're going to expose any of those early flies that emerge and begin feeding on cattle and laying eggs in that manure. You're going to expose them to our active ingredient and stay way ahead of the game. You'll never have a fly population that will explode on you to levels that are above the economic threshold, which is generally recognized as 100 flies per side of animal or 200 flies per animal, horn flies. We recommend feeding that Alticid IGR supplement throughout the summer months and continue 30 days past your first frost in the area, your first average first frost date. And so again, that's going to depend on where you are in the country. And what this does is it continues to expose any of those late adult flies that are laying eggs to the active ingredient. And so those developing larvae will be exposed to the product. They'll pupate and not be able to emerge as adults the following year. Most of these fly species that we've discussed, they'll go ahead and survive the winter months in the pupal stage. So if we can expose that last set of eggs being laid in the late fall, early winter months to the active ingredient and Alticid IGR, we're going to start out with a smaller population of horn flies the following spring. So evaluation is just tracking that population implementing a rotational plan for active ingredients to prevent resistance, and then documenting the progress to make any kind of necessary changes throughout the year. And really, this helps go back, because, as you know, a lot of times you'll just forget, or it won't be at the forefront of your mind from one fly season to the next. So this helps you understand or remember what was used, what was working well for you one year or the year before, and what needs to be used the following year, and helps implement a rotational strategy going into that following year. Central Life Sciences also has a portfolio of packaged good products, which is sold under the Star Bar brand, and we've got all sorts of adulticide type products. This inhibitor product that's on the screen now is a product that we're launching this year. It's a pour-on product that contains lambda cyhalothrin, diflubenzuron, and PBO as a synergist, and so it's very effective against lice and horn flies, horse and deer flies, and can be used on all beef cattle animals. Prolate Lintox is a product that has been on the market for many years. It's one of the last organophosphates that is still approved for use on animals. Very effective against horn flies, lice, ticks, and some of the mites, the mange causing mites. This is a product that can be sprayed. It's not approved for dairy animals, but can be used on non-lactating dairy animals and beef cattle. Cattle Armor is a 1% synergized pour-on, so this has got an active ingredient in it that is also synergized by PBO and can be used on dairy and beef cattle, and very effective against lice and flies. And this is also labeled to be used in back rubbers. And this final product here is a product that we're launching this year. It's called Exalt WDG, and this is a very unique type of a product. It can be applied in both as a granule and spread out, or can be mixed into water and sprayed. And the application sites would be any type of areas that fly larvae are able to develop in that are not mixed with manure, or the manure mixed in that material is aged to the point where a feed-through product that was incorporated and being consumed by those animals is no longer efficacious. So can be spread out like with a handheld fertilizer spreader, or shaken out of these containers, effective against a whole host of fly species, and also has activity against roaches and crickets in areas where they may be problematic around barns and facilities. So just to summarize, Central Life Sciences, we consider ourselves to be a leader in insect pest management. We're the inventor of biorational insect growth regulator technology. We have brand leadership in products that go into livestock, poultry, pet, home, and insecticide markets. And some of these logos here at the bottom of the screen are products you may be familiar with. The 2 feed-through products that I've mentioned in passing tonight, Alticid IGR and Clarifly larvicide, the Star Bar brand of packaged goods products. Diacon IGR is a grain protectant product. Golden Malwren has been on the market since the 70s. It's a scatter bait. It can be used for housefly control. Quick Strike is another scatter bait product that we've got, a rotational product, and can be used with some of our other scatter baits to complete an IPM type of an approach, and then extinguishes a fire ant bait that can be scattered out and controls fire ants in pastures and around homes and buildings. So with that, I'm going to finish up, and I think we're pretty close on time, and I'll ask Michaela if there's any questions or whatever. Mark and I would be certainly glad to answer any of those that come through. Uh, we're really excited to have been asked to participate here tonight, and hope that you learned something. And if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out through our website, or you can find you'll be able to contact one of our field reps through your mineral supplement supplier, your feed dealer, um, in the areas that you're located. They'll have access to one of our reps in any of those areas, and if they can't answer questions for us out in the field, then they'll funnel those back to someone who can. And we appreciate your attendance tonight, and we'll open it up to questions. Michaela, if there's anything that's coming through.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark and Casey, for sharing such valuable information, especially on a topic that is just so important to our producers, especially this time of year. You know, NCBA is all about bringing the top information to producers, and you both certainly helped us achieve that tonight. So with that, we'll go ahead and dive into the Q&A portion. Casey, you mentioned neighbors earlier in the presentation. You know, what do you both, what's some advice that you both have to a producer that has a good pest management plan and a fly control plan in place, but their neighbors don't? Like, what will those flies come over from those neighbors, or what's some advice that you have for that?
Sure, Michaela. I'll start off, and if Mark has anything to add, he can jump in too. The hornfly by nature is not a strong flyer. It's a small fly. They're the behavior of that adult fly is and their dependence upon that host animal is going to lend themselves to sticking to a herd that they've identified once they've emerged from untreated manure. So once they emerge as adults, they're going to find a host, and so cattle are the species that they're going to be able to take blood from and lay eggs in that manure, and those eggs develop into the next generation of adults. You will find them on horses occasionally. You'll find them on goats and sheep and all kinds of stuff. But they're not going to move once they find a host species. They're not likely to move even a few hundred yards to a neighboring herd of cattle. Where you might have some migration is if cattle are, you've got a neighbor that's not using a feed through product, and they've got adult flies emerging from untreated manure, and the flies that come out of that untreated manure, the first animals they find are your cattle. In any herd that you've got that you've got a horn fly control program that's focused on around a feed through product, you're not going to end up with zero flies on animals. Our goal is to keep the fly population below that economic threshold of 200 flies per animal. So there's very few products out there that would be able to limit your fly population to zero or keep it at zero throughout the fly season. And anything that does that would require very frequent applications or reapplications of that. So we recommend, or we tend to advise people that it can be used if your neighbors aren't doing anything. It would be best if your neighbors would acknowledge the benefits that they would observe with some sort of fly control program, whether that is a feed through program or some other fly control approach. But it can certainly be used when your neighbors don't have a good fly control program in place.
That's really helpful. As a follow-up to that, a question came through. Is there something safe for both horses and cattle? Is there a feed through that is safe for both of them?
So the other product that I mentioned, Clarify, it contains the active ingredient diflubenzuron, and Clarify is registered uh, for use in both cattle and horses, as well as swine and sheep and goats. And Clarify is the only product on the market that has approval for all of those livestock species. The rates differ a little bit, but there are some products that are sold by feed manufacturers on the market today that are multi-species labeled products.
The only thing I would add to that, Michaela, is the fly control feed through Clarify is labeled for bovine and equine. The thing you got to be careful of is, though, if you've got a product out for your cattle and horses are also consuming that, there could be, if it's a cattle product, there could be things in that product if that's designed for cows, that are toxic or fatal even to equine, other than the fly control. So the fly control is fine. You just got to be real careful about putting a beef product out for a horse.
Thank you. That's great advice. So on to our next question. What is the best product for mixing into diesel fuel or oil and going into a back rubber? Or do you recommend that?
Yeah, that certainly is one application method that can be very effective and a great tool. We've got a couple of different products that can be used in that manner. One of them is the Prolate product that I talked about earlier. Really, what I would say as an entomologist is that I would want to know a little bit more about what you've used in the past, and I would certainly advise you to rotate chemistry from at least 1 year to another, just to try and maintain the effectiveness of those active ingredients from one year to another, and keep all of those products and modes of action in play for you in the future. So some people tend to go back to what has worked well for them year after year, and eventually, especially when you're talking about the adulticide type of chemistry, the potential for resistance is great, and that's why you will see most all manufacturers and livestock entomologists, your extension folks, are going to promote mode of action rotation, and that's going to just prolong the life of all the different chemistry, and keep you from burning up classes of chemistry as quickly.
Great. We have time for a couple more questions. How long is Altocid active in manure?
So that's the great thing about Altocid. The active ingredient is S-methoprene. The half-life of S-methoprene in soil or microbial environments is going to be fairly short. It's going to be gone, it's going to reach its half-life within about 3 to 7 days, and the microbial degradation is one of the major degradation pathways. Where the beauty of that is that the hornfly life cycle is such that they're being exposed to that active ingredient, and the fact that they only lay eggs and develop in fresh cow manure, they're being exposed before that active ingredient can degrade, and then that active ingredient is not persistent in the environment for long periods of time. So you don't have the likelihood for non-target effects to occur from exposure to S-methoprene, because it breaks down so fast, but is there for in the time frame that hornfly larvae is present, and trying to use that manure as a larval development site.
great. Last question. So how often do you recommend producers rotating products to prevent resistance from forming?
Yeah, so that's the $1 million question. And so there's several livestock entomologists. We've actually got a white paper that we've put together available on our website that talks about this very topic. And there's several different approaches that can be used. And so I think it's going to go back to really understanding what a particular producer has used in the past, what has worked for them, and then what their goals are for the future. So one approach would be to stick with the same type of chemistry until it's no longer effective. I don't like that approach because you know that you've developed resistance by that point, and it forces you to go to a different mode of action, and you don't really know exactly when that product that you have known resistant, or that mode of action that you have known resistance to, will become effective in your area again. So another approach would be to rotate every time you apply. So if you're using a permethrin type spray one time and you're spraying again in a month or 6 weeks or something, you go to an organophosphate type product the next time. That tends to be a little bit, I guess, troublesome in my mind, because you're exposing that fly population to multiple active ingredients in the same year, and you risk resistance developing to multiple active ingredients in 1 year. So I guess if I was going to make a recommendation, and some people may disagree with me, but I would say stick with one mode of action for a fly season. Use that and document what has been used that season, and be sure that you switch to a completely different mode of action, not just a different active ingredient or a different product. You really have to dig deep and understand the mode of action of that active ingredient being used in a product, and switch to a completely different mode of action the next fly season. And it's best to have at least 3 different modes of action that you're using, and where you're rotating different classes of chemistry and modes of action every 3 years. Yeah, that would be my recommendation.
And one point of clarification. So what Casey's talking about right there that's for hard kill chemistry. So that's things Correct. That you're doing to kill adult flies. When it comes to the feed-throughs, because of the way they work, it's kind of called soft chemistry. You're preventing the adults or the immatures from becoming adults. The rotation is not necessary. We don't see any resistance to the feed-throughs, but very much the case with the adults. And it's important not just to look at the brand name, look at the ingredients, look at the active ingredient and what class of chemistry that is, and you'll keep yourself out of trouble.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Mark and Casey, for spending some time with us tonight. And I encourage everyone to go back and watch the recording. You know, they shared a ton of information and gave some really great advice. That recording will be available on our YouTube channel, as well as at ncba.org underneath the producer tab. And I just want to thank you again, Mark and Casey. We really enjoy working with all the folks at Central Life Sciences, and hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.